At 76, Ric Flair still stands as an eternal landmark in the history of American sports entertainment, a name that, just by uttering it, evokes an entire golden era. Over 50 years dominating the ring, he became the symbol of glamour, madness, boldness, and omnipotence that the wrestling world had never witnessed before. 16 world championships recognized by WWE, and more than 20, if you count the full messy history of NWA and WCW, Ric Flair didn't just break records, he set new standards. He led the Four Horsemen, the first and most profoundly influential legendary faction in wrestling history, building an empire that every subsequent generation has had to learn from. Flair turned the art of the promo into a weapon of mass destruction, creating catchphrases that entered mainstream culture, where the Wooo echoes from stadiums to rap songs. His lavish gem-encrusted robes, his proud gestures, his ultimate confidence made him the embodiment of extravagance that wrestling had never seen before. He didn't just step into history, he touched every corner of American culture, from television and music to everyday life. But behind all that spotlight lies a darkness deeper than anyone could imagine. At 76, Ric Flair's body trembles like a warrior who has lived too many lives. His spine was once broken in the 1975 plane crash, patched back together with willpower and recklessness. His heart once stopped on the brink of heart failure, kidney failure, and sepsis. His liver worn down by 40 years drowning in alcohol to forget memories too painful to keep. He carries the pain of 5 broken marriages, children who grew up in the shadow that was too large and too absent of their famous father, and the most horrific tragedy, the loss of his son Reid, a pain that tore him in half and could never be put back together. Yet, like a cruel paradox, it was in his darkest nights, when his breath was as thin as a thread, and his soul sank under the ashes of the past, that Ric Flair chose to stand up again. Not for glory, not for the cheers, but because he refused to become a victim of fate. That will to survive, that grit defiant enough to challenge death itself, is his true legacy. And that's why this story doesn't start with glory, but with a painful truth. Ric Flair has spent his entire life running from wounds that date back to the day he let out his first cry, and somehow he has survived to tell it all. If you want to continue the journey exploring the untold truths behind the tragic life of the Nature Boy, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. And if Ric Flair's story touches you, leave a like as a tribute to the legend who is still fighting every day. But to understand why the 76-year-old Ric Flair carries wounds so deep that no amount of time can heal them, we have to go back to the beginning, a place so dark that no one would believe a legend could be born from it. Ric Flair was not born under the name Ric Flair. Even his real name, no one knows. He wasn't lifted from his mother's womb into warm arms, nor handed to his biological parents. Instead, he was one of thousands of children kidnapped and sold like commodities by the Tennessee Children's Home Society, a front for the most ruthless child trafficking ring in American history. From his very first moment, his life was stripped of the most sacred thing a human can have, the right to belong to someone. A child who had just opened his eyes, had his identity erased, cut off from his roots, exchanged with forged papers and fake smiles. No one knows his real birthday. No one knows who his biological parents were. No one knows why he was taken. That first moment of life, which everyone says should be magical, became the darkest void in Ric Flair's life, an endless abyss he carried with him for decades. He grew up with kind adoptive parents, but that kindness couldn't fill the invisible obsession, the fear of not belonging to anyone. This cruel truth became the shadow that always followed Ric Flair, a shadow he could never escape. No matter how many glittering robes he wore, no matter how many millions chanted his name. In late-life interviews, Ric spoke with a choked voice, as if every word reopened old wounds. I was born into lies, raised in uncertainty. I never knew who I was. When a child begins life without an identity, the rest of their life becomes a desperate journey to find themselves. For Ric Flair, that journey never ends. From a young age he felt the difference, a strange isolation, smoldering like a cold wind blowing from a past he couldn't touch. He didn't understand why he was so angry, why he always tried to get others' attention, why he felt like he wasn't the child in that family. He just knew something was wrong, something was missing, something was empty in his chest that no meal, no birthday gift could fill. And that very emptiness ignited in Ric Flair an intense craving, the craving to be seen, to be recognized, to be loved. Flair didn't run from that pain, it pushed him. It became the engine of his entire life. The more it hurt, the brighter he had to shine, the more isolated he felt, the bigger, louder, more outrageous he had to become, so that someone, anyone would finally see him. But the price was absolute loneliness. When that soul child grew up, sitting alone in his bedroom, listening to sounds echoing from the hallway, he didn't know if he belonged there, or if it was just a temporary stop on his journey of being discarded. With no past to lean on, he was forced to create a different version of himself, stronger, crazier, more glamorous, a version of Ric Flair that the whole world would have to remember, a person created not from love, but from the fear of disappearing. And it was from that tragic beginning that his fate was sealed for the rest of his life. Ric Flair would have to fight to fill the void left by the day he was born, a void so vast that even fame, money, alcohol, women, cheers, and stage lights could never fill it. His childhood wasn't just sad, it was a sentence, a curse, a destiny that locked him into the life of a man who had to live larger than everyone else, just to hide the most painful truth of his life. He was born in silence, and so he spent his entire life forcing the world to hear his voice. And as if fate wanted to test him earlier than any other child, that feeling of being uprooted from his origins right from birth didn't lie dormant in Ric Flair. It grew with him, seeping into every breath, every morning he woke up, every glance in the mirror. While other children found shelter in their parents' arms, Ric felt like a lost guest in his own home. He couldn't explain why, but that isolation clung to him like an inseparable shadow. And then that shadow began to burn into anger, anger at not knowing who he was, anger at not knowing where he came from, anger at not knowing if anyone truly wanted him. As he grew older, Ric Flair became more rebellious, but it wasn't the rebellion of a bad kid. It was the silent scream of a soul trying to find its way out of the vast darkness inside. He fought at school, not because he was tough, but because fighting was the only way to make others see him. He caused trouble not out of mischief, but because he believed silence meant being forgotten again. He dropped out, got expelled from classes, was called to the principal's office so often they knew his name by heart. Young Ric Flair was like a powder keg, volatile, intense, and no one knew how to defuse him. Teachers saw him as an undisciplined boy, but they didn't understand that behind that noisy person was a child searching for the first hug he never had. To escape that nameless void, Ric turned to sports. He threw himself into it not out of passion, but because it gave him a sense of control for the first time in his life. Ric started lifting weights, running, wrestling as if he were trying to strangle his loneliness with muscle. There were days he lifted until he vomited blood, evenings he trained until his legs couldn't hold him up. Physical pain, he endured it like a punishment, a way to self-punish for the unanswered questions he carried in his heart since birth. People often think the strong are those who don't know pain, but Ric Flair is the opposite proof. He was strong because he was too familiar with pain. Physical pain for him was just minor noise, drowning out the louder scream inside, the scream of the abandoned child. He started training as if his life depended on it. In reality, it did. Every drop of sweat was a bit of fear of being forgotten squeezed out. Every time he strained to lift was an attempt to throw away the haunting questions with no answers. But pain wasn't his weakness. It became his fuel. Others quit when exhausted. Ric kept going. Others trained to get fit. Ric trained to survive. To his peers, Ric was both strange and frightening. He was unlike anyone else. He laughed louder, got angry quicker, was more reckless, and no one knew that behind that noise was a terrifying silence waiting to swallow him from within. And then at some point, rebellion was no longer just actions, it became Flair's survival instinct. Ric wasn't afraid of getting hit. He was only afraid no one would remember he walked into the room. Ric wasn't afraid of falling, he was only afraid no one would see him get back up. Ric wasn't afraid of pain, he was only afraid no one would see he was alive. In those teenage years, poverty wasn't what hurt him most. What broke him was the feeling of isolation, as if the world had a place for everyone. But his place had been taken the moment he was born. The invisible child had become a loud, defiant, trouble-making teenager, as if his existence was a challenge to fate. Try to forget me, I'll make the whole world remember. And it was from that origin full of anger, from that violent youth, from that fear of abandonment, that a legend began to take shape. Not from the lights, not from fame, but from the silent battle of a boy trying to reclaim his right to exist. A boy the world never wanted, but one day the world would have to kneel before his name. Those rebellious teenage years seemed like a storm that had forged a Ric Flair tough enough to withstand any wound, but he didn't know that fate was about to deliver the cruelest blow of his life, a blow not from loneliness or isolation, but from the sky. In October 1975, Ric Flair boarded a small plane with his colleagues, Johnny Valentine, Bob Bruggers, David Crockett, and Tim Woods. It was supposed to be just a routine flight to the next show, but the sky that day was gloomy, low clouds, gusty winds. Flair remembered feeling something very strange, as if the air was too heavy to breathe. And then, in a moment no one could prepare for, the plane let out a horrifying screech, the sound of metal being torn apart. Flair heard the engine choke, like a beast being strangled. Then everything happened at once: screams, shaking, metal clashing, and the sensation of his body being hurled into the void. The plane crashed straight into the ground with force enough to shatter most of what was inside it. When Rick opened his eyes, he thought he was dead. Everything was pitch black. The air was thick with the spill of gasoline, burning wood, human flesh. His body had no feeling from the waist down. He tried to move his arms but only felt a sharp, cold pain shooting along his spine. Groans echoed from somewhere, and then went silent. He turned his head, and what he saw haunted him for the rest of his life. His teammates lying motionless beside him, like dolls tossed to the ground. Some were still breathing, some had left this world the instant they hit the earth. Ric Flair tried to scream but couldn't. His breath was so weak it was just like the sound of wind hitting a window. He was trapped, pinned under the seat, bones shattered like glass. No one on the rescue team thought he could survive. They later said that when they first saw Flair, they thought he was just one of the dead. When he was finally pulled from the wreckage, Rick looked up at the gray sky above, as if it was slowly closing in. In his daze, he wondered if anyone would remember him, if he died here. Would anyone tell his name, or would he disappear again just like the day he was born? Then he lost consciousness. When he woke up, Rick found himself in the hospital, everything blindingly white. A doctor stood at the head of the bed, face so grave that no words were needed to know something terrible had happened. And then the doctor said the words that shattered Ric Flair from within his bones: "You'll never walk normally again, let alone wrestle. Your spine is broken in 3 places." Tears streamed down Rick's pillow before he could wipe them away. Not because of the pain. He was used to pain. Physical pain was just noise. What made him cry was the image of a life that hadn't even bloomed yet being crushed in its dreams. Ric Flair, the man who had trained until he vomited blood, who had used sports to keep his soul from falling apart, was now forced to lie motionless, helpless in a stark white hospital gown. He stared at the ceiling for hours, feeling like his body no longer belonged to him, unable to move, unable to stand, unable to run, unable to fight, unable to prove he was worth seeing. Those first days in the hospital were hell. Every night Ric Flair listened to the steady beeps of the heart monitor, and each beep was a reminder that he was still alive, but a part of his soul had died on that flight. He prayed to God not for the pain, but because he was afraid of being forgotten. He was afraid the world would never know the name Ric Flair if he died just as his career was starting. "Please let me stand up, just one more time." He prayed that every night. And it was in the darkness of that hospital room that Ric Flair experienced his first death. But death wasn't what he feared. What he feared, what tormented him most, was disappearing without anyone remembering. The stolen child from years ago was now facing the risk of being erased by life once again. But fate has a strange habit with Ric Flair. It always breaks him, then watches to see if he can put himself back together. The following months were a chain of pain beyond any words to describe. Spine broken in 3 places, a body nearly crushed, but Flair's will was not. He practiced every small movement, each twitch hurting so much his vision blurred, each attempt to stand ending in a fall like a tree uprooted. But he didn't stop, because deep in his heart there was still a burning flame, the flame of the boy who had vowed to make the whole world see him. No one thought he would walk again. No one believed he could return to the ring. Even his family feared a miracle couldn't happen again. But Ric Flair pulled himself back from death with the kind of strength only those who've had everything taken by life possess. Desperation turned into will. 6 months after the accident, when doctors still thought it would take him another year to stand, Ric Flair showed up in the gym, unsteady on his feet, back braced, face pale green. But he stood. He stood to prove he was still alive, and then he walked, each step trembling as if someone was pulling him back toward the hospital bed. But he kept walking, because he knew if he stopped, the invisible shadow that had haunted him since birth would swallow him forever. The day Ric Flair returned to the ring was the day he was reborn, a warrior rising from the rubble. And from that moment on he lived as if every morning was a gift, every match a miracle, and every cheer confirmation that the world had finally seen him. That accident didn't just nearly kill him, it created him. It gave birth to the Nature Boy, a man that fate had broken, but could not bend. From the wreckage of the 1975 plane crash, Ric Flair rose like a man defying both medical logic and human understanding of endurance. No one could believe their eyes when he returned to the ring just months later, back still aching like a knife was lodged in it, breath still catching every time he turned, but eyes blazing like he'd never truly lived before. And in the moment he stepped back into the ring, something new was born. Not Ric Flair, but Nature Boy. Ric Flair, the persona that would take him to the heights of greatness, and also plunge him into bottomless depths. The Nature Boy came into the world not with a cry, but with a woo that tore through the air, like the sound of a soul just escaped from death, and deciding that if life didn't want to remember him, he would make it impossible to forget. From that moment on, Ric Flair no longer entered the ring as an athlete. He entered as a king living in the storm, with a robe glittering like sunlight crushed into crystal dust, waving in the air as if to warm his soul from the chill of deadly memories. People saw a man of power, flowing bleached hair, booming voice, exaggerated confidence nothing could pierce. They saw booze, they saw money, they saw women surrounding him, they saw limousines, luxury hotels, parties lasting until dawn, loud laughter, arrogant quotes no one dared respond to. But they didn't see the one thing that mattered most. Ric Flair drank not for fun, but to fill a void that had existed since the day he was sold like a commodity. He partied not out of excess joy, but because in that noise, he couldn't hear the terrifying whisper of his own voice. He embraced the spotlight not because he loved standing out, but because light was the only thing keeping the darkness chasing him from behind at bay. Every woo rang out like a victory declaration, but to Ric, it was also a scream to chase away the nightmares still lurking in his sleep. He would often wake up in the middle of the night, cold sweat soaking the pillow, feeling like he was still trapped in the wreckage, body crushed, teammates waiting forever for rescue. And then the next morning, he would throw on the sequined robe, rush out in front of thousands, belt out the whoop that made the arena explode, as if the night before had never existed. That was the most painful contradiction of Ric Flair's life. The whole world saw him as invincible, while he himself was the most vulnerable, the weakest, the loneliest, untouched by the healing of glamour. The Nature Boy wasn't a character created for art, it was a shield against the truth that Ric Flair, the man behind the lavish robes, still carried in his heart the fear of being forgotten from childhood, the bone-crushing pain from the plane crash, and an emptiness no applause could fill. But the brighter that shield shone, the more the real man behind it was obscured. Ric Flair embodied the Nature Boy so completely that he no longer knew who he was when the lights went out. He dove into parties so he wouldn't have to return to a lonely hotel room. He drank so he wouldn't have to hear his heart beating in silence. He rushed into fleeting relationships so he wouldn't have to face the truth that he still didn't belong to anyone. And so began the most glorious era of Flair's life, the era when he became one of the greatest icons wrestling ever had. But that was also the era when he began to lose himself. The more dazzling the Nature Boy, the fainter Ric Flair became, the stronger the Nature Boy, the weaker Ric Flair, the more immortal the Nature Boy, the more fragile Ric Flair. People loved that character, but no one knew the man behind it was crumbling bit by bit. In later years, Flair admitted that sometimes he wasn't sure who he was if he wasn't yelling woo. He said he'd lived under the lights so long his soul was scorched, and he'd built a persona so big, so loud, so brilliant that he himself could no longer escape it. And the cruelest truth was, while the whole world was enchanted by the Nature Boy, the man named Richard Flair, the child who was sold, who broke his back, who nearly died, was slowly sinking into the darkness of the very character he created. But that was only the beginning, because the world saw the light, but Ric Flair was stepping closer to the darkest years of his life, years when even the brightest lights couldn't save a man losing his soul piece by piece. But the stage lights didn't just devour Ric Flair's soul, they also dragged him into another war, a war not in the ring, but in the very company he'd poured his life into turning into an empire. With CW, where Flair had once been a living icon, where he'd brought the glory years with the Four Horsemen, began to change. New faces appeared, new leaders took power, and with them came a cold stare for a legend they deemed outdated. Eric Bischoff, a name Flair would later mention with a bitterness that numbed him, became head of WCW. That's when everything fell apart. The years Flair had dedicated were seen as the past, his reputation considered a legacy no longer exploitable, and the loyalty he gave WCW was repaid with public humiliation. They forced him to give up his schedule to serve storylines he didn't believe in. They pressured him, pushed him into situations that made him look weak, and when he objected, they suspended him, stripping him not just of his job but of his purpose in life. Flair, who had once stood in the brightest spotlight in wrestling history, was suddenly treated like excess baggage, an obstacle, a has-been. In one meeting, Bischoff said straight to his face, "You're not important anymore." Just 6 words, but enough to pierce the heart of a man who'd lived his whole life just to be seen. Ric Flair had nearly died in a plane crash, but what hurt him far more was the moment he realized he was being slowly killed by the people who were supposed to respect his legacy. For the second time in his life, he felt himself dying, not from broken bones or spilled blood, but from his soul being stripped away piece by piece. The betrayal choked him more than any wrestling hold. CW was no longer home, it was a battlefield where he was thrown in not as a warrior, but as a target. Every week going to work, Ric Flair felt like stepping into a new battle. They threatened to fire him, they vowed to bury his career, they tried to turn him into a joke, and most painfully they succeeded. People started seeing Flair not as the immortal Nature Boy anymore, but as someone clinging to faded glory. The cheers of before turned into pitying looks, his reputation wavered, his image was distorted. The memories he'd built over decades were torn apart by decisions from people who didn't understand him enough. Ric Flair once said, "I can take pain. I've taken pain my whole life, but I can't take the feeling of being betrayed." And that's exactly what WCW did to him. They didn't beat him in a match, they beat him in the heart. He started losing sleep, losing control, losing direction. Every morning, instead of excitement for the arena, he woke with a tightness in his chest, as if the whole world was trying to suffocate him. He no longer recognized his face in the mirror. It wasn't the Nature Boy with the cocky grin anymore. It was a man crushed, torn between his love for wrestling and the pain of being betrayed by wrestling itself. People think wrestling is fake, but what Ric Flair went through was anything but fake. He fought opponents in the ring. In real life he fought those in power, and with each real-life battle, he lost another part of himself. With CW, where he had once been the sword, the flame, the heart of the show, now became the place extinguishing him. But the cruelest part wasn't the humiliation, it was the truth that he still stayed, still fought, still sacrificed. because deep down he was still afraid of being forgotten like that child from years ago. He stayed to prove he still had value, but every day he stayed took another piece of his soul. The fame he'd built with broken bones now became a burden crushing his already damaged shoulders. WCW didn't just shatter his career, it shattered his sense of self. The man who'd spent his life hiding weakness with Wooo was now forced to face what he feared most, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was nothing anymore. That's when Ric Flair understood that a legend can be immortal in others' eyes, but in his own heart, he can still die again. And sadly, this wasn't the last time he would die. The betrayal from WCW didn't just hurt Ric Flair's career, it shattered the man himself. And when the heart cracks, he did what had always been his only escape. He drank. Ric Flair drank alcohol, as if it was the only thing still loyal to him. Not 3-4 shots. Ric said he drank 15 to 20 shots every day in and day out, for nearly 40 years. For others, that would be a death sentence written in advance. For Ric Flair, it was just a way to keep existing. Alcohol helped him forget Eric Bischoff's shouting in closed-door meetings. Alcohol helped him forget the humiliation of being suspended, forget the pitying looks from younger colleagues, forget the sound of bones breaking from 1975 that still echoed in his dreams occasionally. But most importantly, alcohol helped him escape from himself. The cruel truth was Ric Flair feared silence more than anything, because in silence, he had to face the abandoned child inside him, the child who never knew where he belonged. So he drank to soothe that echo, drank to make his heart stop asking questions that would never have answers, and drank to keep the nature boy from disappearing. But the price for glory always comes, and it came like a storm without warning. Flair's liver began to weaken, his heart struggled to pump, each beat like being stabbed with a sharp needle. His kidneys grew weary from filtering massive amounts of alcohol every night. Doctors said his body was like a car driven 300,000 miles but never had an oil change. But he still drank. It wasn't a choice, it was addiction. A kind of addiction not for fun, but for survival. But the body can't endure forever. Mornings waking up with labored breathing, nights vomiting blood, times passing out that he excused as tired. The physical pain from that old plane crash was now just a small piece. The real pain came from within, where alcohol corroded every cell. But that wasn't all. As his health collapsed, his finances went into freefall too. 2 bankruptcies, millions of dollars evaporated into parties, alcohol, women, and the unrestrained nature boy lifestyle. The IRS, the U.S. tax authority, pursued him no differently than the ghost of his past. Every letter sent home was a reminder that the real world wasn't like the dazzling stage lights. And when the money disappeared, friends disappeared too. Some turned their backs, some took advantage, some who once called him brother vanished when he needed them most. Ric Flair, the legend the whole world had once cheered for, began seeing himself in the mirror as a loser, crushed not by opponents, but by choices leading to desperation. He partied no longer for joy. He partied because he feared the end of the night, feared the pitch-black hotel room, feared the steady hum of the air conditioner, that deadly silence forcing him to face the question he always ran from: who am I really when the Wooo goes silent? And since he had no answer, he kept running into alcohol, running into women, running into all-night parties, running into the nature boy. He kept the nature boy alive, not because he wanted to, but because Ric Flair, the real man, was in too much pain to exist without that mask. Never in his life had he fallen into such a deep abyss. A legend in the ring, but in real life a broken man, finances, health, dignity, and heart. But the cruelest part was this: everyone saw the glamour, but not the cost. They saw the sequined robe but not the unpaid bills. They heard the Wooo but not the gasping breaths backstage. They saw the nature boy, but not the man drinking to forget pain that never left him. And when everything seemed on the verge of total collapse, life had one more blow prepared for Ric Flair, a blow stronger than even that plane crash. Because there are pains that hit the bones, but there are also pains that hit the soul, and what was waiting for Ric Flair ahead would bring him to his knees in a way that alcohol, money, or betrayal never could. But the alcohol and all-night parties didn't just destroy Ric Flair's body, They destroyed everything most fragile around him, the hearts that loved him, the families he was never truly present long enough to build. After decades living in the storm of glamour and emptiness, Ric Flair looked back and realized that behind the path he'd walked were 5 broken marriages, 5 times he walked out of a woman's life, leaving behind closed doors and cries he never heard. The crowd always won the war against family. For Ric Flair, the cheers of the audience, the lights, the entrance music, all were stronger than love. Not because he didn't love them, but because he didn't know how to love anyone except the Nature Boy. The Nature Boy was born to be seen by everyone. But Ric Flair, the real fragile man afraid of abandonment, didn't know how to stay with someone long enough without hurting them. Each of his marriages started with hope and ended in tears. The first wife endured the years he lost control to fame. The second grew exhausted from his impulsiveness and mood swings. The third collapsed under endless parties and days he vanished for shows. The fourth endured the debts and constant drunkenness until the marriage became a battlefield. The fifth, the last one, loved him with tolerance, but had to live with a man too used to running from everything sacred in life. 5 marriages, 5 women who came with hearts full of trust and left with hearts full of scars, and in the eye of that storm, his children stood silently. They grew up with the image of an absent father, a name echoing around the world, but rarely echoing in their own home. Rick often said he loved his kids. He believed it. But loving is one thing, being there is another. When he toured over 300 days a year, when nights he was blacked out and couldn't tell day from night, when he chased the lights to the point of forgetting who was waiting at home, the children understood that the Nature Boy always came before their dad. Charlotte, the daughter who later became a WWE superstar, spent her entire childhood trying to get close to him. She wanted her father to see her, really see her. But Ric Flair back then wasn't a father. He was a fire burning everything around him. Charlotte stood right beside him, but still felt miles away, obscured by the sequined robe and the woo that rang louder than any words of love her father never said. He appeared in the children's lives the way he appeared in the ring, brilliant, explosive, intense, but only for moments. Then he vanished. Many years later, in tears, Ric Flair admitted, "I chose wrestling over my family. I chose the crowd over my children." And that was the most painful confession a man who'd spent his life craving love could make. Because the children grew up with a legend, but without a father. Every birthday, every bedtime, every school sports game, those moments didn't have Ric Flair, Flora, Ashley, Charlotte, Megan, and especially Reid. Each child carried in their heart a void shaped like their father, not because he didn't love them, but because he was too afraid to face himself, so he always ran. Ran into shows, ran into alcohol, ran into the applause of 20,000 strangers, people he believed loved him more than he dared believe his family would. But this is the painful truth. Ric Flair didn't abandon his family out of indifference. He abandoned them because he didn't know how to stay. The child sold away years ago, the child who didn't know who he was, the child who belonged to no one, grew into a man who didn't know how to let others belong to him. And this tragedy lasted decades, smoldering like a bloodless wound but aching every night. By the time he wanted to be a father, the years for fathering had passed. By the time he wanted to truly love, his heart was too weary to relearn the simplest thing. And then life prepared for him a pain greater than all the broken marriages combined. A pain that struck straight into the soul and made him collapse in a way that fame, alcohol, or debt never could. A pain named Reid Flair. But no pain from those broken marriages, no loss from debts or loneliness, no wound on Ric Flair's shattered body could compare to what was waiting ahead. Because if Flair's life was a series of spiritual deaths, the blow named Reid Flair was the only death he could never recover from. Reid wasn't just the youngest son, he was a young replica of Rick, handsome, charismatic, born with a magnetism that lit up every room he entered. In Reid's eyes burned the same fire as the Nature Boy, the same confidence, the same smile that made others believe he was born to be a star. But unlike his father, Reid didn't need to create the Nature Boy. He had a genuine light of his own. Flair looked at his son and saw in him everything he'd ever dreamed for himself. Effortless talent, a sensitive heart, and a craving to be loved without hiding behind glamour. But that light was born in the overwhelming shadow of Ric Flair, and that very shadow, glamorous, loud, never knowing when to stop, blocked Reid's path, pushing him into the deepest darkness. Reid grew up watching his father drink to forget pain, party to escape fear, spend money to fill emptiness, and like every child wanting their father's love, Reid learned to become the version that would get noticed. He became reckless. He wanted his father to see him, not the real-life Ric Flair, but the nature boy. Reid wanted to make his dad proud, and that's when the tragedy began. Reid turned to alcohol, to crowds, to the lifestyle Flair could never control. But for Reid it was worse. He turned to drugs, something Ric had avoided throughout his career, not out of curiosity, not out of rebellion, but because he was trying to numb his own pain, the pain of a child who always thought his father's love was something to be earned by living bigger, crazier, stronger than everyone else. Ric watched his son slip away like sand through his fingers. He checked into rehab to bring him back. He used money to bail Reid out of legal trouble. He begged promoters to give Reid a chance to wrestle. He traded everything to pull Reid from the abyss. But every time he saved him one step, Reid fell back too, not because Reid wanted it, but because he was crushed by the shadow of Ric Flair that no one could surpass. Charlotte once said that Reid was born with the most fragile heart in the family, but that was exactly what made him unable to withstand the invisible expectations. Ric once looked at his son sitting in the car, face pale green after an overdose, and said words he later repeated with cruelty aimed at himself. "My son is too much like me, and that's the worst thing that could happen." Reid wasn't addicted to a bad life. He was addicted to the feeling of being seen by his father, and Ric, though he loved his son with his whole soul, couldn't give him what he needed: a father, not a legend. Reid's final years were a mix of hope and tragedy. He tried to get clean to make it to WWE. He promised this time would be different. Ric believed. Ric wanted to believe more than anything. And then, that fateful day came. The morning of March 29, 2013, a day Ric Flair wishes he could erase from history. Reid was at Flair's home in Charlotte. He'd come back from wrestling in Japan, and said he was tired, wanted to rest. Ric felt something very strange that day, a chest-tightening unease he couldn't name. The night before, father and son talked longer than usual. Reid hugged him and said, "I love you, Dad." Flair didn't know it would be the last time. The next morning, Flair called but got no answer. He thought Reid was sleeping off the long flight. Then something, the fatherly instinct he rarely listened to, pushed him to open the door. He stepped in. Dim light fell on the motionless figure on the floor. Reid, his son, unmoving, his face deathly pale, eyes half closed as if trying to open but couldn't, body limp, growing cold. A haze of death hung in the room as if it had waited all night for Flair to enter. And in that moment, Ric Flair, the man who'd survived a plane crash, hundreds of bloody matches, dozens of surgeries, collapsed before his son's body like a child. He held Reid, shook him, screamed his name. He yelled as if the scream could pull Reid's soul back. That yell echoed through the walls, out the door, making neighbors rush over thinking there was a murderer. It wasn't the voice of the nature boy. It was the voice of a father watching his world crumble before his eyes. A yell more painful than any bone snap he'd ever heard. A heart-rending yell. A yell that even today, Ric himself can't forget, because it's tied to the image he never wants to remember, the child he once cradled now lying motionless on his own floor. Reid died right in Flair's home, and on the record, the cause was listed as drug overdose, drugs he'd hoped his son had stopped using. Ric Flair sat beside Reid's body for over an hour, before anyone could convince him to let go. He didn't want to leave. He kept repeating, "No, he's still alive. He just needs Dad to talk to him." But Reid couldn't hear him anymore. At the funeral, Ric Flair stood before the casket, and said words that silenced the entire wrestling world. "I killed my son with the life I chose." He didn't kill Reid, but he believed he did, and that was the greatest pain. He believed that if he hadn't lived as the nature boy, if he'd been home more, if he'd been a real father, Reid wouldn't have sought escape in alcohol, in drugs, in things he thought would make his dad proud. Flair didn't just lose his son, he lost the only remaining piece of soul in the man named Richard Flair. After Reid's death, the world saw Ric Flair fall, but they didn't see the scarier part. He never fully got back up. He smiled on TV. He made guest appearances. He yelled "Woo" whenever the crowd needed it. But deep in his heart, where his lifelong loneliness, fear of abandonment and pain had piled up, there was now a pitch-black hole no stage light could reach. Years later, when talking about Reid, Flair could only whisper, "I never thought I'd outlive my son." That's the burden he carries every day, every night. And from that moment, the Nature Boy, the immortal legend, died in a way, while Ric Flair, the flesh and blood man, only continued existing as a lost soul, living on because he couldn't yet find a way to forgive himself. But life wasn't done with him yet. The tragedy of Reid was just the eye of the storm. The years ahead would push Ric Flair to the brink of death once more, and this time, not just his heart breaking but his body. After Reid's death, Ric Flair's life didn't just crack, it completely collapsed. The Nature Boy, the icon who once stood before tens of thousands with blazing eyes, now became a trembling shadow of himself. If before he drank to escape, from the day Reid left, he drank to destroy himself. No control, no restraint. Alcohol became the only way to avoid facing the image of his son dead on the floor, an image burned into his mind like an indelible scar. Those close to him said they'd never seen anyone drink like Ric, not to have fun, but to forget. Every night was mental torture. He closed his eyes and saw Reid. He heard his son's calls in the wind. He felt his hand growing colder in his own. And in that inescapable pain, Ric began saying something he'd never considered in his life. "I wish I'd died instead of him." He didn't say it once. He said it many times. To friends, to Charlotte, to himself on drunken nights. Sometimes he said it without realizing, why not me? Why him? He had his whole life ahead. It wasn't just words, it was a self-imposed sentence. And when a man who's spent his life running from loneliness says he wants to die, it means the darkness has completely swallowed his soul. His career didn't escape the storm either. Both WWE and networks saw he could no longer hold himself together. He showed up erratically, slurred speech, trembled when walking, eyes bloodshot from alcohol and crying. People no longer saw the Nature Boy. They saw a father falling apart. His career stalled, then nearly froze. Those who once called themselves friends gradually vanished too. No one wanted to be around a man so grieving, so uncontrollable, so likely to collapse at any moment. And adding fuel to the fire, the plane ride from hell scandal resurfaced, this time in a social media era harsher than any before. Ric was mocked, ridiculed, called sick, fake legend, washed-up old man. Some who once idolized him became his harshest critics. For Ric Flair, that humiliation was a second brutal storm after Reid's death. He lost his son, and now he lost his dignity. The dignity he'd built with broken bones, blood, tears, head-first dives, 40 years of dedication, now twisted into a joke by people who only knew him from TV. Ric Flair, the immortal legend, became a symbol of society's irony, and he felt there was no place left for him in this world. In a rare interview, Ric admitted he'd lost the will to live. He didn't imply it. He said it straight. "I don't want to wake up another day." That was the darkest chapter of his life. A chapter with no light, no hope, no way out. He'd survived a plane crash. He'd survived bloody matches. He'd survived debts, betrayal, himself. But he couldn't survive the pain of losing Reid. And every bottle he drank wasn't to forget, but to slowly disappear. Many nights, Charlotte sat outside his door, listening to him cry in silence. A man who once made the world stand and cheer, now only had strength to whisper, "If he were here, I'd be okay. If he were here." But Reid didn't come back, and Ric Flair, in the depths of despair, believed he was no longer worth living, no longer worth loving, nothing left to save. That's when he let go. And life, as if not cruel enough, decided to throw him into the abyss one more time. This time not just his soul dying, but his body starting to surrender too, because ahead was the moment Ric Flair came closest to real death. The death he'd once wished for in exchange for his son. But life, as if not cruel enough, decided to test Ric Flair one more time, this time with something he couldn't run from, couldn't drink away, couldn't drown out with a woo, real death. In 2017, After months drinking to the point his body no longer distinguished night from day, Ric Flair suddenly collapsed. He was rushed to the hospital in absolute critical condition: heart failure, kidney failure, severe sepsis, and vitals dropped to levels where any normal person would have died before reaching the ambulance. When doctors asked his wife at the time, "How much does he drink a day?" she replied, "From morning to night, no stopping." The doctors didn't believe it. They thought no one could drink like that and still breathe. But that was Ric Flair. The man, accustomed to existing in limits the human body wasn't designed to endure. When wheeled into the ICU, doctors raced against time. His body was ravaged to the point organs no longer functioned by any rules. They put him on a ventilator. They pumped antibiotics. They gave fluids. They shocked his heart. But every monitor screamed red. They said only a miracle could save him. And then what his family feared most arrived. Ric fell into a deep coma. 11 days. 11 days, with almost no hope. 11 days where every breath was just a machine's reflex. 11 days where the man who once made the whole world stand and cheer lay motionless like a sleeping child. No more light, no more laughter, no more nature boy. Just a solitary Ric Flair on the boundary between life and death. Throughout that time, the doctors told the family, "Prepare yourselves. His chance of survival is almost zero." They didn't say it to comfort. They said it because they believed it was the truth. Charlotte sat by her father's bed every day, unable to say anything but squeeze his hand, hoping he could feel it through his cooling skin. Old friends, those who stayed after all the storms, visited and couldn't hold back tears. Some said goodbye thinking it was the last time. The funeral home was contacted. Clothes were prepared. They began discussing arrangements. A legend, a father, a man who'd bounced back from a plane crash, survived unimaginable battles, now just a fragile, feeble image, like a candle about to go out. But somewhere in the deepest darkness of the coma, Ric Flair's soul hadn't accepted leaving yet. Not this time. Not when he hadn't apologized to his children. Not when he hadn't made amends for Reid, though he knew it could never be fully done. Not when he hadn't faced the abandoned child inside himself that he'd run from his whole life. Outside, his family cried. Inside, his heart, though weak enough to be just a whisper, made the most important decision of his life: he would stay. And then, like something no one dared hope for, on the 12th day, Ric Flair's eyes opened. Not wide open, not immediately alert, but opened, enough to shatter the death sentence hanging over him for nearly 2 weeks. The doctors were stunned. Charlotte burst into tears. Nurses called to each other in panic. And Ric Flair, the man who'd escaped death in 1975, defeated it one more time. But this time, he didn't wake as a warrior. Didn't wake with loud laughter or the nature boy grin. He woke like a man who'd just seen hell and decided he didn't belong there. He was so weak he couldn't lift his arm. He hurt so much he couldn't breathe fully. His organs threatened to shut down in waves, leaving him unsure how many more days he had. But his eyes changed. No more arrogance, no more defiance, no more challenging the world. In those eyes was the deepest regret, the unrelenting pain over Reid, and a frail but genuine will. "I want to live. I have to live, to fix what I destroyed." That wasn't Ric Flair talking for the doctors. That was Ric Flair talking to himself. He'd once loudly declared himself immortal, that death had to wait in line. But facing the real end, he no longer wanted to pretend strength. He wanted forgiveness, wanted to be loved, wanted to love back, wanted to atone, and that was the rebirth. But a tragic rebirth. Ric Flair didn't walk out of the hospital like a hero who'd beaten death. He walked out like a man who'd just had every truth about himself exposed. He wasn't immortal. He wasn't invincible. He couldn't yell "woo" to hide the pain forever. He was human, wounded, flawed, and trying to find a reason to keep going. But the most painful part of this rebirth was to keep living. The 2017 version of Ric had to abandon the man he once thought he was. The nature boy, the reckless, defiant, always strong, always immortal, had no place in a body dying from alcohol. Ric had to choose: either keep being haunted by the past, or learn to live an authentic life, no matter how painful. And that's when he made the second most important decision: I will stay, not for me, but for those I hurt. That was the promise he reminded himself of every morning, looking at the surgical scar on his stomach. That was why he quit alcohol. That was why he relearned to walk. That was why he practiced breathing, eating, speaking, like a newborn child again. But this time, he wasn't reborn to become the nature boy. He was reborn to become Richard Flair, the man he'd lost since that soul child let out his first cry. And that was the most beautiful tragedy of Ric Flair's life. He came back to life, but no longer the old man. He came back to pay debts, to love, to repair, to keep existing with pain that never went away. But for the first time in his life, he didn't run from it. After waking from the death the doctors said he couldn't possibly escape, Ric Flair entered a second life. One without cheers, without glittering lights, without alcohol to soothe the pain. Just stark truth. He was alive, and so he couldn't keep destroying what little was left. The doctors told him, if he drank one more drop of alcohol, just one, he would die. Not a threat, but a medical conclusion. And for the first time in his life, Ric Flair feared death not for losing life, but for losing the chance to make things right. So the nature boy, who once drank 20 shots a day, who treated partying like breathing, began a completely different battle, the battle against himself. He quit alcohol, quit completely. Not because it was easy, but because there were no other choices. The hand tremors, the nights of cold sweats, the times his heart raced from his body craving booze, all tormented him like the price for 40 years of mistakes. But he endured, because for the first time he wanted to live, not to shine, but to repair the ruins he'd caused. Ric relearned to walk from scratch, practiced deep breathing, slept without alcohol, ate healthy, practiced being normal, something life hadn't given him a chance at for over 60 years. But the hardest wasn't quitting alcohol, it was learning to be a father when it was too late. Flair knew he couldn't turn back time to make up for missed birthdays, advice he never gave, moments he chose the crowd over family. But he could start from now, late, painful, clumsy as it was. And the one who opened the first door for him was Charlotte. Charlotte, the girl who'd grown up in her father's glittering but cold shadow, the girl once obscured by the nature boy, the girl who'd cried over broken promises, drunkenness, absence. Now stood by the hospital bed, holding his hand as if their shared pain over Reid had erased all distance between them. After he woke, father and daughter started really talking, something they'd never done before. No more lights, no more nature boy, no more audience, just Ric and Ashley, two people hurting for the same reason, Reid's death. They talked about Reid like he was still in the room. They cried mentioning him. They laughed remembering his antics. They shared pain no one else could understand. And in those conversations, Ric Flair realized the cruelest thing in his life. He'd always tried to make the world love him, while the one who needed him most, Charlotte, stood alone watching from behind. So he changed. Not to be loved, but to be worthy of love. Flair started listening more, slowing down more, talking less, apologizing more. He learned to truly be present in Charlotte's life, not just on TV. And Charlotte, strong but deeply wounded, opened her heart to her father again. She didn't need a legend. She needed a dad who could sit beside her, a dad who could grieve, regret, love. Ric Flair, the man who'd lived like a fallen angel, now lived like a soul relearning to stand. He reorganized his life, prioritizing health, family, peace. He no longer tried proving anything to the world. He just tried proving to himself he deserved this second chance. But even as he laughed more, stayed sober more, loved more truly, there was one thing that never went away, the smoldering sadness like an unhealed scar, always under the skin, hurting at the slightest touch. The sadness of the man who'd lost a son, the sadness of a father who believed the best part of himself died with Reid, the sadness of the identity-less orphan child, still carrying the unanswered question, who am I when the cheers go silent? But he accepted that sadness. No more running, no more drinking to forget, no more yelling woo to hide. Ric Flair kept living, not as the immortal legend, but as a man trying to repair, love and forgive himself, and perhaps, that was his greatest victory. In Ric Flair's second life, the life where he was forced to slow down, forced to face wounds no scalpel could stitch, only one flame was strong enough to keep him standing. Charlotte Flair, not alcohol, not fame, not the Wooo that once shook arenas, but his daughter who'd grown up in the gaps he left, yet chose to come back and hold his hand right when he thought he had nothing left to hold on to. Charlotte wasn't just a daughter, she was the most beautiful legacy Ric Flair's life ever created. Every time she stepped into the ring with the robe inherited from the Nature Boy, every powerful yet graceful move, Ric stood backstage watching her like a miracle he didn't deserve. Charlotte didn't just inherit Ric's talent, she inherited his heart, a heart tough enough to carry both their pains and still shine before thousands. There were times Charlotte entered matches with tear stains still fresh on her face, tears from nights her father ached remembering Reid, because every time Charlotte competed, Ric saw Reid in his daughter's eyes. That was something both beautiful and cruel. Beautiful because Reid's light still lived in Charlotte, cruel because every moment she shone was a reminder that the one who should stand beside her, Reid, was gone forever. Once Charlotte said that after a big match, as she came backstage, Ric hugged her so tight she thought he'd fall. He cried. She cried too, not because of the match, but because that moment of glory hurt so much it stung, as if Reid stood between them, both present and absent. She said, "Don't you see, Dad? Every time I step out there, I carry Reid with me," and Ric could only nod choked up. They'd cried like that many times, backstage at WrestleMania, in the gym, even in the car driving home. Those tears weren't weakness, but two souls who'd lost a part they'd never get back. But that shared pain connected them in a way no happy moment could. Charlotte was the one who pulled Ric from nights he wanted to disappear. She reminded him to take meds on time, forced him into physical therapy, made doctors talk straight to him when he slacked on health. She was the one who put her hand on his back when he trembled at the airport, the one who turned off the TV when he tried watching his young self to torture his heart, the one who sat beside him for hours in silence, just so he didn't face the most tormenting loneliness. After death brushed so close in 2017, Ric confessed he didn't know why he woke, until he saw Charlotte holding his hand. "I'm alive because of you," he said. And Charlotte replied gently but heartbreakingly, "You're alive because of you. I just remind you of that." Charlotte gave Ric a reason to keep living, a reason beyond fame, beyond glamour, not to return to the stage, not to reclaim glory, but to stay, to love, to atone, to not miss another day with those left after the tragedies. In training sessions, Ric stood beside Charlotte, watching her perfect moves he'd done in youth, but when she did the figure eight, inspired by his figure four, Ric felt his heart squeezed. Because it wasn't just professional legacy, it was the legacy of a family missing a part that could never be replaced. Charlotte understood that. She never mentioned Reid as pain, but as presence. Every time she spoke of him, her voice didn't shake, it just deepened, like placing a hand on her father's scar to soothe it. And Ric, who'd lived his life to be seen, finally understood there was a love needing no lights, no cheers, no glamour, the love Charlotte gave him. But even in that healing, a quiet shadow still draped every moment, the smoldering sadness over Reid. It didn't stop them living, didn't stop them loving, didn't stop them moving forward, but it made every happy moment more fragile, more precious, and sometimes more painful, because they knew a part of the family would always be missing, a chair would always be empty, a laugh would never ring again, and they carried that sadness, not as a burden, but as the remnant of a love too big, too deep, too real. And in that blend of grief and hope, Ric Flair stands firm in old age, not as an immortal legend, but as a father learning to keep going, thanks to the flame Charlotte lit for him, a flame that never goes out, but always flickers in the wind of memories. Looking at Ric Flair in his later years, people don't just see a legend, they see a map of losses and rebirths. But to understand his legacy, the thing that will live on long after he's gone from this world, you have to look beyond the championship belts, beyond the sequined robes, beyond even the Wooo, echoing through stadiums. You have to look at America itself, where Ric Flair left a mark so deep it can't be erased. In popular culture, few have spread as far as he has. Basketball players, football players, UFC fighters, from LeBron James and Conor McGregor, to rappers like Snoop Dogg, Offset, Pusha T, all cite Flair as inspiration. They wear robes modeled after his. They yell "Woo" in celebrations. They repeat his cocky quotes like victory declarations. Ric Flair didn't just influence wrestling, he influenced the life energy of an entire country. He turned bragging into art. He turned madness into an icon. He made the nature boy style an essential part of American culture, where people always dream big, live big, love big, make big mistakes, and get back up just as big. But what most of the world doesn't see or chooses to forget is that the wounds that never healed are what created that greatness. Ric Flair's glamour didn't come from joy, it came from pain. The Woo wasn't a confident cheer, it was the sound of a man yelling loud to drown out the weak screams inside him. The lavish robes weren't for showing off, they were to cover the massive voids in his heart. Every match wasn't just performance, it was Flair proving he still existed. Flair's legacy, therefore, was never the championship belts. Belts rust, titles get passed to others, legends get replaced by new ones. But resilience, forged from the plane crash, from betrayal, from 40 years of alcohol, from Reid's death, from 11 days in a coma, from hundreds of falls both in and out of the ring, that's what no generation can forget. Ric Flair taught America that a person can live wrong, live reckless, live fast, live wild, live in darkness, but still rise from their own ashes. Taught young people that perfection doesn't create legends, survival does. Taught fathers that they can hurt their children, but still learn to love again. Taught addicts that the line between life and death is thinner than they think, but it can be crossed if they decide to cross it. Taught the lonely that even those loved by the whole world can feel abandoned, and that doesn't make them weak. But the greatest lesson, the one Flair brought to the soul of American culture, was what he said trembling in his hospital bed, after losing his son, losing the glamour, losing his strength. You can lose everything, but you can't lose yourself. That is Ric Flair's true legacy. Not the chops that exploded arenas, not the classic matches, not the quotes that went down in history, but the truth that a man can live too much, make too many mistakes, lose too many precious things, but still find his way back to himself. And when he stands there in old age, with a worn-out body, with sadness that never fades, with a heart still aching for Reid, still regretting the years he missed, he can still smile, because he knows something he didn't know his whole life. He's alive not to be glorified, but to be forgiven. And perhaps that's the noblest victory a legend can achieve. At 76, Ric Flair no longer struts with long, powerful strides like in his glory days. His walk is slower now, as if each step carries the extra weight of memories, losses, and names no longer called. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but because his body paid the price for a life beyond all limits. But his eyes, those eyes are still earnest as ever, still holding that fragile but defiant light of someone who's seen hell and come back, not to boast victory, but to tell a story. The current Ric Flair is like a living statue, half legend, half wound. The dazzling robes aren't worn often anymore, but people can still imagine the sparkle every time he enters a room, not because he brings it with him, but because he once was it. But the glory, the Woo, the glorious nights when crowds leap to their feet, all now like distant stars, bright but untouchable. And when Ric stands alone in quiet space, what he misses most isn't the legendary matches, the times he made arenas explode, or the belts that once made him immortal. What he misses are the people who've left him forever, the faces that once laughed beside him in locker rooms, the teammates who died in the 1975 plane, the wives he couldn't keep, the friends who left him after the storm of fame, and Reid, the most beautiful face, the purest, the most innocent smile in all the memories he carries. Nothing hurts Ric Flair more than waking each morning and remembering that Reid will never grow old. He'll forever be 25, forever the young light in a life picture that's long gone dark. In recent years, as his health weakens, as breathing gets heavier, as stage lights don't call his name like before, Ric starts looking back at his life like watching a movie, where he's both the main character and a helpless audience. He sees the young boy sold right after birth, always afraid of abandonment. He sees the rebellious teen pushing himself into danger to be seen. He sees the nature boy, blinding, reckless, defiant, but terrifyingly lonely. He sees the battles, the cheers, the unmatched glamour. Then he sees Reid lying there, ice cold, sees himself collapsing beside his son's body, hears his own scream, the most haunting sound of his life. Ric Flair lived a life too big, big enough that no body could endure it, no heart could hold it, no soul could escape without being torn by all those blows from fate. And when people ask him if he regrets anything, Ric Flair, the man who once claimed immortality, who lived like a storm, only answers in a small, weak but utterly real voice that silences every heart. I survived to tell this story, but I paid for it with everything I ever loved. That's not the words of a legend. That's the words of a human, a man who understood that glory comes easy, but paying the price lasts a lifetime. Ric Flair no longer tries to erase the darkness, he carries it with him, as an inseparable part of the journey. And then, in the late afternoon, sunlight falling like the last light of a long day, people can see Ric Flair standing there, weary posture, but back straight in the only way a warrior can. He walks into the sunset of his life, carrying scars no light ever reaches, pains that became companions, memories never washed away, but he doesn't bow his head, doesn't hide, doesn't collapse. Ric Flair walks like someone who's survived every storm, not fearless, but because he knows that every step, even trembling, is proof he chose to stay, to live, to atone. And in that moment, the legend Ric Flair is at his most beautiful, not because of the Wooo that once shook the world, but because of the quiet pride of a man who's lived too much, lost too much, but still holds his head high like a warrior to the final second. At the end of that journey, the story of Ric Flair is no longer just the story of a wrestling legend. It becomes a painful mirror, reflecting what America often forgets: the people at the peak of glory are often those carrying the deepest wounds. When we see the dazzling nature boy with gem-encrusted robes and Wooo exploding arenas, we don't see the child sold at birth, don't see the young man with a broken back in the crushed 1975 plane, don't see the father collapsing before Reid's cold body on the floor. We applaud immortality, forgetting that behind those lights is a man facing daily the fear of being forgotten, the fear that drove him to alcohol, to endless party nights, to 2 bankruptcies, to the 2017 hospital bed, where doctors said he had 5% chance of survival. But the world needs to see Ric Flair not just through his falls, but through the times he chose to get back up, chose to quit alcohol after 40 years drowning in it, chose to live to make amends with Charlotte, chose to carry Reid's pain like a scar never hidden, instead of running from it. And in that very vulnerability, we see a profound lesson for American society. Glory doesn't save people, glamour doesn't cure loneliness. People are only saved when they dare face the darkness inside themselves. Ric Flair, who lived too much and lost too much, leaves America his most memorable words: "You can lose everything, but don't lose yourself." A message worthy not just of celebration, but of reminding us all about the value of courage, forgiveness, and true love. If Ric Flair's story, full of loss, but also full of resilience, touches your heart, hit subscribe to join us in continuing to explore the human journeys behind the glamour. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we keep telling the truest stories about people who fought, fell, and got back up.